So today I'm going to read from The New God Image by Dr. Edward Edinger, a study of Jung's key letters concerning the evolution of the Western God image. Today I'm going to read from his two letters by the Reverend David Cox. Now these are very important letters, I believe. They have been hidden by the Jungian community, in my belief, for several decades. I believe that's because they were trying to protect the fledgling profession of psychotherapy from attacks by theologians. But anyway, it's part of the evolution of human consciousness, so it's something that I think we need. Before I begin the actual letters, I want to read this prefatory material from Dr. Edinger. In Chapter 9, page 109 of The New God Image, Dr. Edinger says, "The Cox letters were written September 25, 1957, and November 12, 1957. In the first letter to David Cox, Jung gives a description of the historical evolution of the God image from two different standpoints. The first standpoint is what he calls the Euhemeristic standpoint, which refers to the ancient figure Euhemerus, who lived about 300 years BC. He developed a personalistic, rational interpretation of mythology. His idea was that mythology was, of course, all the bunk, that it does not refer to anything transcendent. There are no such things as gods. Rather, mythology derives from certain prominent human beings who made an impression on their contemporaries. These larger-than-life human heroes then got translated into myth. Such a rational, personalistic attitude is called Euhemerism today. Jung says it is one way of looking at the evolution of the God image." I'm just taking abbreviated portions of this because I want to get into the letter itself, but I'm going to carry on a little bit later in what Dr. Edinger said. "The metaphysical world is understood as the projection of human psychology, so that the whole transpersonal dimension that used to be experienced as part of the realm of the gods is explained away euhemeristically. It is a common modern viewpoint. According to this description, then, the ego outgrows the gods. The result is that it left a dissociated state, because it is cut off from the transpersonal dimension out of which it comes. Since a dissociated state is not satisfactory, Jung goes on to speak of the other way of looking at it, from the standpoint of the archetype. From that standpoint, the evolution of the God image is thought of as a dynamic process of development in the archetype itself. It does not just reflect the development of human consciousness, but is an image of its own inner evolution." So this is a later portion in Dr. Edinger's comment. He says, "Society is no more than the sum total of all the individuals that make it up. It is not anything else. Therefore, the collective psyche of the human race is the sum total of all the individual psyches. If a certain number of individual psyches have had the experience whereby the God image, by reaching consciousness, has achieved the transformation, then those few individuals will function something like yeast in the dough. The interesting question, of course, is how many will it take? The Old Testament went into this question. You remember Abraham disputed with Yahweh about how many righteous men there would have to be in a city before he would decline to destroy it. He, Abraham, got him down to 10. I think we have to take that symbolically rather than literally. There is no way of knowing, I think. I think each individual ought to live his life out of the hypothesis that maybe one would do. This was Jung's comment. And then he says, Jung makes clear that the task is a dangerous one. Quote, in order to accomplish this task, this is the task of the union of the opposites, the incarnation task, man is inspired by the Holy Ghost in such a way that he is apt to identify him with his own mind. He even runs the grave risk of believing he has a messianic mission and forces tyrannous doctrines upon his fellow beings. He would do better to disidentify his mind from the small voice within, from dreams and fantasies through which the divine spirit manifests itself. One should listen to the inner voice attentively, intelligently, and critically. Probate spiritus, test the spirits, because the voice one hears is the influxus divinus, consisting, as the Acts of John aptly state, of the right and left streams, i.e., of opposites. They have to be clearly separated so that their positive and negative aspects become visible. Only thus can we take a middle position and discover a middle way. That is the task left to man, and that is the reason why man is so important to God that he decided to become a man himself. Unquote. I'm going to leave this part of Dr. Edinger's talk and go directly into the David Cox letters now. There's a footnote here that I suppose I should read to you. This is footnote number 1. Extracts from H.L. Philip, Jung and the Problem of Evil, London, 1958, pages 239 to 250. The book consists of correspondence between the author, Philip, and Jung in the form of questions and answers in English, and an extended critical attack of 175 pages on Jung's writings on religion, with particular reference to Answer to Job. So this is one of these theologians who was often attacking Jung during his lifetime. But it says, it concludes with Jung's answers to questions sent by another correspondent, the Reverend David Cox, author of Jung and St. Paul, 1959. Jung's answers to Cox's letters are reproduced here by permission of the Princeton University Press. Well, I actually have no permission from Princeton University Press, but I consider this a fair use, so I'm going to go on. The letter to David Cox, 25 September 1957. The crux of this question is, within your own personality, Christ can be an external reality, historical and metaphysical, or an archetypal image or idea in the collective unconscious, pointing to an unknown background. I would understand the former mainly as a projection, but not the latter. So what he's saying here is that Christ as an external reality, as a historical and metaphysical figure, is a projection. But if you understand Christ as a symbol of the self, which is the deepest archetype within the unconscious, then Christ is an archetypal image or idea in the collective unconscious, pointing to an unknown background. I would understand the former mainly as a projection, but not the latter, because it is immediately evident. It is not projected upon anything, therefore there is no projection. Only faith in Christ is different from faith in anyone else, since in this case, Christ being immediately evident, the word faith, including or alluding to the possibility of doubt, seems too feeble a word to characterize the powerful presence from which there is no escape. A general can say to his soldiers, "You must have faith in me," because one might doubt him, But you cannot say to a man lying wounded in the battlefield, "You ought to believe that this is a real battle," or, quote, "Be sure you are up against the enemy," unquote. It is just too obvious. Even the historical Jesus began to speak of faith because he saw that his disciples had no immediate evidence. Instead, they had to believe, while he himself, being identical with God, had no need to have faith in God. As one habitually identifies the psyche with what one knows of it, it is assumed that one can call certain supposed or believed metaphysical entities non-psychic. Being a responsible scientist, I am unable to pass such a judgment, for all I know of regular religious phenomena seems to indicate that they are psychic events. Moreover, I do not know the full reach of the psyche, because there is the limitless extent of the unconscious. Christ is definitely an archetypal image. I don't add only. And that is all I actually know of him. I'll read that sentence again. Christ is definitely an archetypal image. I don't add only. And that is all I actually know of him. As such, he belongs to the collective foundations of the psyche. I identify him, therefore, with what I call the self. The self rules the whole of the psyche. I think our opinions do not differ essentially. You seem to have trouble only with the theological and self-inflicted devaluation of the psyche, which you apparently believe to be ultimately definable. If my identification of Christ with the archetype of the self is valid, he is, or ought to be, a complexio oppositorum. Historically, this is not so. Therefore, I was profoundly surprised by your statement that Christ contains the opposites. Between my contention and historical Christianity, there stretches that deep abyss of Christian dualism, Christ and the devil, good and evil, God and creation. Beyond good and evil simply means we pass no moral judgment. But in fact, nothing is changed. The same is true when we state that whatever God is or does is good, since God does everything. Even man, created by him, is his instrument. Everything is good, and the term good has lost its meaning. Good is a relative term. There is no good without bad. I'm afraid that even revealed truth has to evolve. Everything living changes. We should not be satisfied with unchangeable traditions. The great battle that began with the dawn of consciousness has not reached its climax with any particular interpretation, apostolic, Catholic, Protestant, or otherwise. Even the highly conservative Catholic Church has overstepped its ancient rule of apostolic authenticity with the Assumption Beatae Virginis, the Assumption of the Virgin Mary. And this is a reference to Pope Pius XII's papal bull in 1950, in which he acknowledged that the Virgin Mary went into heaven. According to what I hear from Catholic theologians, the next step would be the co-redemptrix. This obvious recognition of the female element is a very important step forward. It means psychologically the recognition of the unconscious, since the representative of the collective unconscious is the anima, the archetype of all divine mothers, at least in the masculine psyche. The equivalent on the Protestant side would be a confrontation with the unconscious as the counterpart or consort of the masculine logos. The hitherto valid symbol of the supreme spiritual structure was Trinity plus Satan, the so-called 3+1 structure, corresponding to three conscious functions versus the one unconscious so-called inferior function, or 1 plus 3 if the conscious side is understood as 1 versus the so-called inferior orthonic triad, mythologically characterized as 3 mother figures. I suppose that the negative evaluation of the unconscious has something to do with the fact that it has been hitherto represented by Satan, while in reality it is the female aspect of man's psyche, and thus not wholly evil in spite of the old saying, vir a deo creatus, mulier a simia Dei. It seems to me of paramount importance that Protestantism should integrate psychological experiences, as for instance Jacob Boehme did. With him, God does not only contain love, but on the other side, and in the same measure, the fire of wrath in which Lucifer himself dwells. Christ is a revelation of his love, but he can manifest his wrath in an Old Testament way just as well, i.e., in the form of evil. Inasmuch as out of evil good may come, and out of good evil, we do not know whether creation is ultimately good or a regrettable mistake and God's suffering. It is an ineffable mystery. At any rate, we are not doing justice either to nature in general or to our own human nature when we deny the immensity of evil and suffering and turn our eyes from the cruel aspect of creation. Evil should be recognized, and one should not attribute the existence of evil to man's sinfulness. Yahweh is not offended by being feared. It is quite understandable why it was an evangel, good tidings, to learn of the Bonitas Dei and of his Son. It was known to the ancients that self-knowledge was a prerequisite for this, not only in the Greco-Roman world, but also in the Far East. It is to the individual attitude that the man Jesus owes his apotheosis. He became the symbol of the self under the aspect of the infinite goodness, which was certainly the symbol most needed in ancient civilization, as it is still needed today. It can be considered a fact that the dogmatic figure of Christ is the result of a condensation process from various sources. One of the main origins is the age-old god-man of Egypt, Osiris Horus and his 4 sons. It can be considered a fact that the dogmatic figure of Christ is the result of a condensation process from various sources. One of the main origins is the age-old god-man of Egypt, Osiris Horus and his 4 sons. It was a remodeling of the unconscious archetype hitherto projected upon a divine non-human being. By embodying itself in a historical man, it came nearer to consciousness, but in keeping with the mental capacity of the time, it remained as if suspended between God and man, between the need for good and the fear of evil. Any doubt about the absolute Bonitas Dei, goodness of God, would have led to an immediate regression to the former pagan state, i.e. to the amorality of the metaphysical principle. Since then, 2,000 years have passed. In this time, we have learned that good and evil are categories of our moral judgment, therefore relative to man. Thus the way was opened for a new model of the self. Moral judgment is a necessity of the human mind. The Christ is the Christian model that expresses the self, as the anthropos is the corresponding Egypto-Judaic formula. Moral qualification is withdrawn from the deity. The Catholic Church has almost succeeded in adding femininity to the masculine trinity. Protestantism is confronted with the psychological problem of the unconscious. It is, as far as I can see, a peculiar process extending over at least 4,000 years of mental evolution. It can be contemplated in a Euhemeristic way as a development of man's understanding of the supreme powers beyond his control. The process consists of the following stages. 1. Gods. 2. A supreme deity ruling the gods and demons. 3. God shares our human fate, is betrayed, killed or dies, and is resurrected again. There is a feminine counterpart dramatically involved in God's fate. 4. God becomes a man in the flesh and thus historical. He is identified with the abstract idea of the summum bonum and loses the feminine counterpart. The female deity is degraded to an ancillary position, the church. Consciousness begins to prevail against the unconscious. This is an enormously important step forward in the emancipation of consciousness and in the liberation of thought from its involvement in things. Thus, the foundation of science is laid, but on the other hand, that of atheism and materialism. Both are inevitable consequences of the basic split between spirit and matter in Christian philosophy, which proclaimed the redemption of the spirit from the body and its fetters. 5. The whole metaphysical world is understood as a psychic structure projected into the sphere of the unknown. The danger of this viewpoint is exaggerated skepticism and rationalism, since the original supreme powers are reduced to mere representations over which one assumes one has complete control. This leads to a complete negation of the supreme powers, scientific materialism. The other way of looking at it is from the standpoint of the archetype. The original chaos of multiple gods evolves into a sort of monarchy. The archetype of the self slowly asserts its central position as the archetype of order in chaos. One god rules supreme, but apart from man. It begins to show a tendency to relate itself to consciousness through a process of penetration, the humanizing effect of a feminine intercession, expressed, for instance, by the Isis intrigue. In the Christian myth, the deity, the self, penetrates consciousness almost completely without any visible loss of power and prestige, but in time it becomes obvious that the Incarnation has caused a loss among the supreme powers. The indispensable dark side has been left behind or stripped off, and the feminine aspect is missing. Thus, a further act of incarnation becomes necessary. Through atheism, materialism, and agnosticism, the powerful yet one-sided aspect of the summum bonum is weakened so that it cannot keep out of the dark side and incidentally the feminine factor anymore. Antichrist and devil gain the ascendancy. God asserts his power through the revelation of his darkness and destructiveness. Man is merely instrumental in carrying out the divine plan. Obviously, he does not want his destruction, but is forced to it by his own inventions. He is entirely unfree in his actions because he does not yet understand that he is a mere instrument of the destructive superior will. From this paradox, he could learn that he serves a supreme power, and that supreme powers exist in spite of his denial. As God lives in everybody in the form of the scintilla of the self, man could see his demonic, i.e. ambivalent, nature in himself, and thus he could understand how he is penetrated by God and how God incarnates in man. Through his further incarnation, God becomes a fearful task for man, who must now find ways and means to unite the divine opposites in himself. He is summoned and can no longer leave his sorrows to somebody else, not even to Christ. because it was Christ that has left him the almost impossible task of his cross. Christ has shown how everybody will be crucified upon his destiny, i.e., upon his self as he was. He did not carry his cross and suffer crucifixion so that we could escape. The bill of the Christian era is presented to us. We are living in a world rent in two from top to bottom. We are confronted with the H-bomb, and we have to face our own shadows. Obviously, God does not want us to remain little children looking out for a parent who will do their job for them. We are cornered by the supreme power of the incarnating will. God really wants to become man, even if he rends him asunder. This is so no matter what we say. One cannot talk the H-bomb or communism out of the world. We are in the soup that is going to be cooked for us, whether we claim to have invented it or not. Christ said to his disciples, "Ye are gods." This word becomes painfully true. If God incarnates in the empirical man, man is confronted with the divine problem. Being and remaining man, he has to find an answer. It is the question of the opposites, raised at the moment when God was declared to be good only. Where then is the dark side? Christ is the model for the human answers, and his symbol is the cross, the union of the opposites. This will be the fate of man, and this he must understand if he is to survive at all. We are threatened with universal genocide if we cannot work out the way of salvation by a symbolic death. In order to accomplish his task, man is inspired by the Holy Ghost in such a way that he is apt to identify him with his own mind. He even runs the grave risk of believing he has a messianic mission and forces tyrannous doctrines upon his fellow beings. He would do better to disidentify his mind from the small voice within, from dreams and fantasies through which the divine spirit manifests itself. One should listen to the inner voice attentively, intelligently, and critically. Probate spiritus, test the spirits, because the voice one hears is the influxus divinus, consisting, as the act of John aptly state, the right and left streams, i.e. the opposites. They have to be clearly separated so that their positive and negative aspects become visible. Only thus can we take up a middle position and discover a middle way. That is the task left to man, and that is the reason why man is so important to God, that he decided to become a man himself. I apologize for the length of this exposition. Please do not think I am stating a truth. Okay, before I go on to this next two paragraphs are the two paragraphs that kind of knocked my socks off when I read it the first time. These two paragraphs are the reason why I'm reading this letter now. I must apologize for the length of this exposition. Please do not think that I am stating a truth. I am merely trying to present a hypothesis, which might explain the bewildering conclusions resulting from the clash of traditional symbols and psychological experiences. I thought it best to put my cards on the table so that you get a clear picture of my ideas. Although all this sounds as if it were some sort of theological speculation, it is in reality modern man's perplexity expressed in symbolic terms. It is the problem I so often had to deal with in treating the neuroses of intelligent patients. It can be expressed in a more scientific, psychological language. For instance, instead of using the term God, you say unconscious. Instead of Christ, self. instead of incarnation, integration of the unconscious, instead of salvation or redemption, individuation, instead of crucifixion or sacrifice on the cross, realization of the four functions or of wholeness. I think it is no disadvantage to religious tradition if we can see how far it coincides with psychological experience. On the contrary, it seems to me a most welcome aid in understanding religious traditions. A myth remains a myth, even if certain people believe it to be the literal revelation of an eternal truth, but it becomes moribund if the living truth it contains ceases to be an object of belief. It is therefore necessary to renew its life from time to time through a new interpretation. This means readapting it to the changing spirit of the times. What the Church calls prefigurations refers to the original state of the myth, while the Christian doctrine represents a new interpretation and readaptation to a Hellenized world. A most interesting attempt at reinterpretation began in the 11th century, leading to the schism in the 16th century. The Renaissance was no more a rejuvenation of antiquity than Protestantism was a return to the primitive Christianity. It was a new interpretation necessitated by the devitalization of the Catholic Church. Today, Christianity is devitalized by its remoteness from the spirit of the times. It stands in need of a new union with or relation to the atomic age, which is a unique novelty in history. The myth needs to be retold in a new spiritual language, for the new wine can no more be poured into the old bottles than it could in the Hellenistic age. Even conservative Jewry had to produce an entirely new version of the myth in its Kabbalistic gnosis. It is my practical experience that psychological understanding immediately revivifies the essential Christian ideas and fills them with the breath of life. This is because our worldly light, i.e., scientific knowledge and understanding, coincides with the symbolic statements of the myth, whereas previously we were unable to bridge the gulf between knowing and believing. Coming back to your letter, pages 2 through 3 of September 25th, I must say that I could accept your definition of the summum bonum. Whatever God is, that is good, if it did not interfere with or twist our sense of good. In dealing with the moral nature of an act of God, we have either to suspend our moral judgment and blindly follow the dictates of this superior will, or we have to judge in a human fashion and call white white and black black. In spite of the fact that we sometimes obey the superior will blindly and almost heroically, I do not think that this is the usual thing, nor is it commendable on the whole to act blindly, because we are surely expected to act with conscious moral reflection. It is too dangerously easy to avoid responsibility by deluding ourselves that our will is the will of God. We can be forcibly overcome by the latter, but if we are not, we must use our judgment, and then we are faced with the inexorable fact that, humanly speaking, some acts of God are good and some bad, so much so that the assumption of a summum bonum becomes almost an act of hubris. If God can be understood as the perfect complexio oppositorum, so can Christ. I can agree with your view about Christ completely, only it is not the traditional, but a very modern conception, which is on the way to the desired interpretation. I also agree with your understanding of Tao and its contrast to Christ, who is indeed the paradigm of the reconciliation of the divine opposites in man brought about in the process of individuation. Thus Christ stands for the treasure and the supreme good. In German, good equals gut, but the noun gut also means property and treasure. When theology makes metaphysical assertions, the conscience of the scientist cannot back it up. Since Christ never meant more to me than what I could understand of him, and since this understanding coincides with my empirical knowledge of the self, I have to admit that I mean the self in dealing with the idea of Christ. As a matter of fact, I have no other access to Christ but the self, and since I do not know anything beyond the self, I cling to this archetype. I say, here is the living and perceptible archetype which has been projected upon the man Jesus, or has historically manifested itself in him. If this collective archetype had not been associated with Jesus, he would have remained a nameless Zadok. I actually prefer the term self because I am talking to Hindus as well as to Christians, and I do not want to divide but to unite. Since I am putting my cards on the table, I must confess that I cannot detach a certain feeling of dishonesty from any metaphysical assertion. One may speculate, but not assert. One cannot reach beyond oneself, and if somebody assures you he can reach beyond himself and his natural limitations, he overreaches himself and becomes immodest and untrue. This was Dr. Jung's criticism of Martin Buber, who did make such assertions. This may be a deformation professionnelle, the prejudice of a scientific conscience. Science is an honest-to-God attempt to get at the truth, and its rule is never to assert more than one can prove within reasonable and defensible limits. This is my attitude in approaching the problem of religious experience. I am unable to envisage anything beyond the self, since it is, by definition, a borderline concept designating the unknown totality of man. There are no known limits to the unconscious. There is no reason whatsoever why you should or should not call the beyond self Christ, or Buddha, or Purusha, or Tao, or Kidder, or Tefrith. All these terms are recognizable formulations of what I call the self. Moreover, I dislike the insistence upon a special name, since my human brethren are as good and as valid as I am. Why should their name-giving be less valid than mine? It is not easy for a layman to get the desired theological information, because even the Church is not at one with herself in this respect. Who represents authentic Christianity? Thus the layman, whether he likes it or not, has to quote Protestant or Catholic statements pell-mell as Christian views because they are backed up by some authority. In my case, I believe I have been careful in quoting my sources. You, as a theologian, are naturally interested in the best possible view or explanation, while the psychologist is interested in all sorts of opinions because he wants to acquire some understanding of mental phenomenology and cares little for even the best possible metaphysical assertion, which is beyond human reach anyhow. The various creeds are just so many phenomena to him, and he has no means of deciding about the truth or the ultimate validity of any metaphysical statement. I cannot select the best or the ultimate opinions because I do not know which kind of opinion to choose from which church. Also, I do not care particularly where such opinions come from, and it is quite beyond my capacity to find out whether they are erroneous or not. I would be wrong only if I attributed, for instance, the idea of the Immaculate Conception to Protestantism, or the idea of faith alone standpoint to Catholicism. The many misunderstandings attributed to me come into this category. In either case, it is plain to see that someone has been careless in his assumptions. But if I attribute Ritschl's Christological views to Protestantism, it is no error in spite of the fact that the Church of England does not subscribe to the opinions of Mr. Ritschl or of Mr. Barth. I hope I have not inadvertently been guilty of some misquotation. I can illustrate the problem by a typical instance. My little essay on Eastern meditation deals with the popular tract Amityar Dharma Sutra, which is a relatively late and not very valuable Mahayana text. A critic objected to my choice. He could not see why I should take such an inconspicuous tract instead of a genuinely Buddhist and classical Pali text in order to present Buddhist thought. He entirely overlooked the fact that I had no intention whatever of expounding classical Buddhism, but that my aim was to analyze the psychology of this particular text. Why should I not deal with Jacob Boehme or Angelus Silesius as Christian writers, even though they are not classical representatives either of Catholicism or Protestantism? A similar misunderstanding appears in your view that I am not doing justice to the ideal of community. Whenever possible, I avoid ideals and much prefer realities. I have never found a community which would allow full expression to the individual within it. Suppose the individual is going to speak the truth, regardless of the feelings of everybody else. He would not only be the most abominable enfant terrible, but might equally well cause a major catastrophe. Edifying examples of this can be observed at the meetings of Buckman's so-called Oxford Group movement. At the expense of truth, the individual has to behave, i.e., suppress his reaction merely for the sake of Christian charity. What if I should get up after a sermon about ideals and ask the parson how much he himself is able to live up to his admonitions? In my own case, the mere fact that I am seriously interested in psychology has created a peculiar hostility or fear in certain circles. What has happened to those people in the church, that is, in a Christian community, who ventured to have a new idea? No community can escape the laws of mass psychology. I am critical of the community in the same way as I suspect the individual who builds his castles in Spain while anxiously avoiding the expression of his own convictions. I am shy of ideals which one preaches and never lives up to, simply because one cannot. I want to know rather what we can live. I want to build up a possible human life which carries through God's experiment and does not invent an ideal scheme, knowing that it will never be fulfilled. That is the first of the two letters.